Hello, everyone. Welcome to our policy simulation library meeting. Thank you all for attending. I'm Matt Jensen, the director of the Open Source Policy Center at the American Enterprise Institute. Today we have an exciting presentation on macroeconomic modeling at the Federal Reserve. But before we jump into that, let me just give a couple of brief announcements from other folks in the community. First item is that there's a new white paper out on Tax Cruncher, which is a tool for simulating how individuals would be affected by tax policy reforms. You can enter an individual's information, and then you can enter a policy reform and see how the individual of the tax unit, doesn't have to be an individual, it could be a married filing jointly tax unit, but the tax unit, see how the tax unit is influenced by the reform. There's a white paper that goes into details, and soon, but not quite yet, there will be a video demo as well. In addition to that, there was a recent release on Compute Studio, which is the platform where a variety of the models in the policy simulation library are deployed as web applications. And that release on Compute Studio now means that you can create simulations and share them and have a variety of other fairly powerful features if you're a user of the models on Compute Studio. So check those out, compute.studio/PSL models. With that, thanks again for coming, and let's jump into our feature presentation. Mr. Del Negro from the New York Fed will be presenting on macroeconomic modeling at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Marco Del Negro. Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. Very happy to be here. I'm going to be talking about the models at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and in particular, DSGE model. And I should point out that whatever I say are my views and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. So I am going to talk about various aspects of the New York Fed DSGE model. I'm going to start by having one slide that just has a panoramic view of what the model is. Then, given that's why I'm here, I'm going to spend a few slides on why we use Julia and why our code is open source. Then I'll talk the uses of the model and monetary policy analysis. I'll have a longish part on forecasting performance that is based on the paper that is linked there, that is written with a number of co-authors. And then, plans ahead. Now, because this presentation touches on various points of the model, what I would ask you, if you're okay, is to ask questions right away as you see them. You don't have to wait to hear all about forecasting if you don't care at all about forecasting, but you really care about open source. So if you have, again, questions, clarification, just raise your hand. Perhaps possibly wait for the microphone, please, so that the people who are watching us online, they can hear what you're saying. And if you want to introduce yourself and your institution, do so. If not, you're free not to do so, and then ask your questions. All right? Okay. Okay. So what's the New York Fed DSGE model? Well, I don't know if I should have spelled out what DSGE model is. So DSGE model is dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium. Dynamic because it's a model of an economy with many periods. It's a quarterly model. Stochastic because there are shocks, and I'll talk about scenarios later on. And general equilibrium in the sense that it's a general equilibrium model of the economy. Obviously, since we do monetary policy, it's a little bit hard to do that in a partial equilibrium setting where prices don't move, because the whole point of what we do is price control. You might have heard about the work of Frank Smets and Ralph Wouters, who were among the first to estimate this DSGE model and show that in terms of forecasting performance, they were comparable and maybe better, or anyway comparable to other models used quantitatively in macroeconomics. And I think their work was really fundamental, was foundational for the DSGE model, because at that point central bank realized that, hey, those DSGE models are not just theoretical toys that can be used for to hone ideas, but also tools that can be used for quantitative analysis and forecasting, which is what we do with the New York Fed DSGE model. Now, this Smets and Wouters model was a new Keynesian DSGE model like this one, but that did not have any financial frictions. And that meant a couple of things, right? That an important aspect of the economy, which is that there is a financial system, and that financial system is perhaps not perfect, was missing from that model. And second, that in terms of observables on which the model is estimated, there were no financial variables other than obviously the federal funds rate because of monetary policy. And when you want to take the model to data or forecast what happens in the aftermath of the Great Recession, it's pretty obvious to anybody that having financial variables in the model is probably not a bad idea. And Bernanke, Gertler, and Gilchrist, and Cristiano Motta and Rossagno are two sources which we use in terms of building the financial friction model. The observables, the variables that we use to estimate the model are listed there. We use a couple of measures of the growth rate of output, consumption, investment, the real wage, hours worked, two measures of inflation, long-run inflation expectation, just to see, we use a survey of professional forecasters. So in this case, professional forecasters believe that inflation is heading in the very long run. The federal funds rate, the 10-year treasury yield. John Fernald's, who's a guy who used to work at the San Francisco Fed, measure of total factor productivity growth. And as I was saying, the BAA spreads as a measure of spreads as an important financial variable in the system. The model was developed between 2007 and 2009 originally, and then has been routinely in use after that. Okay, it changed over time. It's not a static thing. Obviously, we're not. That's our job to change the model and to try to improve it. But the main features that are listed there were pretty much a constant of the model. Okay, any questions or comments? Good. Okay. Now, I say there the model has been vetted academically. What does it mean? That we make an effort to connect the New York Fed DSGE model with the work of academia. That means two things. One, we want our model to be at the frontier of the current state of models, as much as possible, at the frontier of the current state of models of this kind. for a pretty obvious reason. We don't want to lag behind, right? But also, we want to put our models out there in terms of presenting it in academic conferences and using it in papers that are published in good economics journals. And there are three fairly recent examples, or handbook, or anyway, stuff that is peer-reviewed or has editors and so on, right? Why do we do that? Well, because we think it's very important that, you know, what we do is checked by the profession, and, you know, as you probably know, there's no better way to do that than, you know, have the referees have a go at it and provide comments and feedback, and other economies. And so that's why we do that. The other reason, which is important, is that the researchers at the New York Fed, right, they do policy as that's their job, but they're also researchers. And the opportunity to publish the papers when working on the models on good journals, well, there's certainly an incentive for them to give the best that they have on the model. Or another way to restate what I just said is you know, there are institutions, there are situations where institutions, you know, have their model, and the only ones that understand their models are those who work in the institutions, and, you know, those models are not published. Nobody else out there knows what the model is doing. That's not us. We don't think that's very helpful because you don't get feedback, you know, from the rest of the world, which leads us to talking about open source. Okay? All right. So Julia and open source. The models code is available on GitHub. By the way, all the blue things on the presentations are links either to papers or to sites. And its documentation is kept up to date. The model is currently written in the language Julia. I'll tell you more about that. Surprisingly, it's quite a popular Julia package. You know, if you think about the fact that Julia packages used to be 5th, now it's 15th. I think that it's my mother clicking on it and putting likes. No, seriously, I mean, if you think that the Julia packages are stuff that is much more fundamental, like, you know, plotting, doing statistics, than the DSGE model, it's kind of surprising that that is so well, quote unquote, liked. But most importantly, aside from the likings, you know, people use it. We have 122 forks, that is, people expanding on the code on GitHub. And in those, Liberty Street Economics, which is the blog post of the blog of the New York Fed, the New York Fed model Julia and forecasting with Julia, we explain why we chose Julia as a programming language and why we make our code open source, but I'm going to tell you more about that now. Okay, why Julia? We used to use MATLAB up until 5 years ago. You know, MATLAB is a great language, arguably, at least in macro, the most popular language currently used, very mature programming language, and, you know, we served our purposes very well for many years. But we moved to Julia for 2 reasons. One is that it's free. Free means that it's more accessible to, you know, academic institutions or organizations or students, anybody from all over the world, right? And if we want to share our code, well, you know, it doesn't really help if those guys have to pay a lot of money to then use it, because not everybody can do that. So, you know, The other, is not on the slides, but is perhaps even more important, is that, these days we use clusters a lot, right? I don't know if you heard about XCD, which is a cluster basically funded by the NSF. We use other clusters that are provided by the Fed. In all of these clusters, you want to do parallel. And the license for doing parallels are super expensive and it takes a while to get. So having a code that is free, just is fantastic because you just install your Julia and you're ready to go. Okay, and we found that in practice is super important. And my colleagues who are using other languages, not free languages, they gotta wait to use, for somebody to buy the language, the license and so on. We don't, which is great. Okay. The other reason why we moved away from MATLAB and we moved into Julia is that, again, as I said, we want to be at the frontier. We want to, use models that therefore are more and more complicated and computationally intensive. And that means that we have to do computations at high speed unless you want to wait a year before estimating that model. And, Julia boasts performance that as fast as that of languages like C or Fortran. And on the plus, is a lot simpler than those languages to learn for economists. Now, performance as fast as C or Fortran is arguably a bit of an exaggeration. If you write, good code in C, you're going to be faster than good code in Julia. But A, not by much, and B, good code in Julia can be far faster than maybe not optimized code even in C or Fortran. We had several instances of we porting Fortran code that was written by people who were pretty good actually. And we managed to get it faster by porting it to Julia. Okay? And as I said, we want to address hard questions. We want to move beyond the representative agent, the new Keynesian, one agent, the very stylized financial friction model. We want to go nonlinear, as I'll talk about later. To do all of these things, we need, a language that allows us to solve stuff really fast. And we thought that the language that we were using was just a roadblock. We were not going to go anywhere sticking with the previous language. And so we moved on to Julia. Okay? Any questions, comments? Yeah, please. Do you mind getting the microphone?
Two simple ones. First of all, what is the size of this model in terms of number of equations? And what is the periodicity? Is it monthly, quarterly, yearly? And from that, two things. You've estimated over a long period of time, 1960 on. Have you re-estimated since 2010 or so, given the changes in financial behavior over that time? And what do you find in terms of results? Are there major issues or just minor perturbations in the parameters? And finally, in terms of forking, you have a lot of forks. But are you concerned at all about your model essentially getting out of control, where somebody will say, well, we use the FRB model, and yet they have made sufficient changes so that it would produce different results and essentially cast some doubt on the veracity of the model?
So thanks for your question. And please follow the example. This is great if we make it more interactive. Yeah, so the model is quarterly. It's how many equations. That really is not quite what matters in terms of solving it is kind of the number of because you can write a lot of identities and make it right. So for these models, is really the size of the state space that matters. I can give you a number. Maybe probably we use something around 40 states, depending on the specifications. But it's fast enough at the moment, right, to solve. So solve it just takes a fraction of a second. If you want to estimate it, and we use Bayesian method to estimate, you have to visit the entire parameter space. So you want to do that, millions of times, right? And that obviously adds up. Now, a few years ago, that was meant overnight or maybe a day, depending how fast your code was. These days, also thanks to new techniques such as sequential Monte Carlo that we've been using, it's a few hours. So these models, are not a big deal computationally even now. But if we want to make it harder, so for instance, address some of the questions that you ask about, changes in regime, changes in parameters, which is, by the way, something that we're working on, then the computational aspects become harder as well, and therefore faster language becomes more helpful. Okay. Now, we haven't, you need enough data to estimate that model. So we haven't done the exercise that you asked just because our data is with a little lag and we don't have, 10 years is probably not enough to have a totally separate regime for the latest period. But that's a good question, and maybe we should address it at some point. Any other question? Thank you. Okay. Next, why open source? So open source, so anybody can easily download the code and most importantly, offer suggestions on how to improve it by posting enhanced version. By the way, another question that you had is, okay, what if people use the model and then they change it? That's what happens in academia and in research all the time. Obviously, if they change it, it's their model. If they don't change it and they find something strange, it's good to know. That's the whole point. And they say the DSGE model, they write a paper, the New York Fed DSGE model doesn't work in that dimension. I'd rather know it than not knowing it. So that's the point. Okay, right, which I guess takes me to is going to be discussed in the next slide. But for now, collaboration. So why we make it open source, right? We use packages produced by other people all the time. So, it's just natural that what we do, we make it available to other people. And by the way, what we do is not only the model itself, which not everybody may care about, but also a bunch of subroutines or other ancillary packages, such as state space model estimation in Julia, sequential Monte Carlo in Julia, you name it. Okay, Metropolis Hastings in Julia. And, researchers appreciate that. In fact, in importing the model from MATLAB to Julia, we had help from people from QuantEcon, which is an organization, a nonprofit founded by Tom Sargent, and this is John Strakursky. And part of the deal with QuantEcon is, okay, we helped you and you guys made it public, which we're super happy to do that. making it public, and the fact that other central banks use it, and they do use it because they ask us questions, just enhances the visibility of the New York Fed, and I think that's great for the institution, and also promotes good modeling, good policy, and so arguably that's good. And the other aspect, which is the one that we just touched upon, is model validation. I mean, all models are faulty. All models can be improved. If nobody else sees it other than your economists, who, obviously have their own, we have our own, perhaps narrow perspective, having worked with this model for a long time, it's good that the rest of the world, which has a different perspective, sees it, plays with it, criticizes it, right? And so in that sense, or more narrowly, find bugs if there are any. Obviously, we are humans. We make mistakes. We try not to, but it can certainly happen. Put the code out there and let people find them, okay? Now, people got back to us, or there were some issues which were super minor, so it was not a big deal, but still is great to know that a number of other people have looked through the code, and if they don't understand something, they either email us or put a comment on GitHub and say, hey, why is this part of the code doing that? I don't understand. Because, arguably that's the best way of validating the model. Okay? That closes the part on open source. Any questions? Nope. Let's continue. All right, so how do we use this model in policy analysis? I'll talk a little bit about forecasting the US economy, some positive analysis, normative analysis, and then some scenarios. So we use this model for forecasting. We do this pretty much every cycle. And 4 times a year, so it used to be press conference cycle, now the press conference is every cycle, so that those slides are outdated. Every SCP submission cycle, we sent a memo to the FOMC with the DSGE forecast. After 5 years, those memos are public, and if you click on that link, you can see some of those memos from, up to 2014. Now, another aspect of the open source view that we have is that actually you don't have to wait 5 years to see our forecast, because we make it public pretty much right after we send it to the FOMC. The board is totally fine with that. And we started doing that in 2014. Okay? And so these are just a list of posts. We do that using a Liberty Street blog post, which has a really short commentary about most of the forecasts, the table with the numbers and the projections. I'll show you in a second what that looks like. I should stress the following. We don't forecast because we think our model is the top of the pop in forecasting. I'm sure there are better models out there for forecasting. But the reason to forecast, especially for specific variables, say you want to just forecast GDP growth or inflation. The reason to forecast is that forces us to confront our model with the data every cycle. We use this model for quantitative policy analysis to produce numbers. It's kind of crazy that a model that is used for quantitative analysis, you don't check it. Or let me restate it. If your model produces pretty crazy forecasts, forecasts that are unrealistic, then probably you may not want to use it for quantitative policy analysis. So you want to have that check. And we do that, and we let the rest of the world do it for us if we don't do that properly, by putting our forecast out. So, of course, just the nature of the forecast, they always miss. But at least we know where the model is deficient, and part of that is by looking at that forecast. So that we view forecasting as a way of testing the model. Okay? And that's what kind of the blog looks like. And we also have a similar internal publication. See, the blog only comes out 4 times a year. This thing comes out every time we produce a forecast. I guess a good thing about the model, a DSGE model is a structural model. Structural model means that within the confines of the model, which obviously is a super simplified view of the economy, but you know exactly what's going on. So if you miss the inflation forecast, and this I'm plotting like revisions in forecast from one quarter to the other, right? If you're missing the inflation forecast, you know exactly, you can back out what shock caused the revision. If you use a reduced form model, right? Your forecast changed from here to here. Why did that happen? Well, I don't know. Right? With this model, you can say, it was, you see many shocks, many colors. We don't need to go through that in details, but right, you can ask the model, okay, what surprises, how do you map the forecast error that you made into changes in the shocks in the economy? What happened to the economy, right? And so here it said, well, there was productivity growth that was lower than expected, and that did something to inflation, okay? All right? The other thing, yes, please. Do you mind waiting for the microphone just 1 second?
I was just wondering, in terms of the forecasting, whether you interact your forecasts with your nowcasts. There's a lot of work done that if you initialize the forecast with the nowcast, you can do much better. And I was wondering, given that you have the nowcast model at the New York Fed, what the interaction between those two is.
Absolutely, that's a great question. We do use, a DSGE model, just for the nature of the beast, is probably not the best model, or definitely not the best model for nowcast. Why not? Well, among other things, because a nowcasting model has data on anything that is out there right now. Surveys, the Dallas Fed manufacturing survey, all qualitative, quantitative surveys that are out there, right? The DSGE model has just those series that I plotted, that I had out there, right? Which being NEPA series, we only get mostly with the lag plus it's quarterly. So when initializing the model, we actually condition on the nowcast. Now, because the nowcast just became available 2-3 years ago, historically we have conditioned on the judgmental forecast from the New York Fed, or when we show results from professional forecasters. So we haven't yet conditioned on the nowcast, but that's just a technical detail, meaning that we could use that. I guess, the nowcast for now is just for GDP, right? But we also want a condition on say, hours worked and inflation. The judgmental forecasts give us, all three, and being from the same source, they are consistent, right? So it's not obvious that you want to use GDP from the nowcast and then inflation from the judgmental, but, those are details. Thanks. Right. The other thing is, as I was saying, the DSGE interprets the data using shocks, identify shocks, interpretable shocks, but also has objects that are of interest to policymakers, such as the natural rate of interest that obviously, or the output gap, that are latent. That is, you don't see the natural, you don't measure it. NEPA doesn't produce it. But, the DSG model, the whole point of it to some extent, is like to interpret the data and tell you what it thinks it is, right? And so what I'm plotting there on the left-hand side is just the history of the real natural rate of interest together with the real federal funds rate, over the whole estimation sample. And, again, just like with innovations, we can, if it went down the way it did, we can tell you why, right? So, the plot on the right makes a story that it was mostly financial shock, which we interpret as demand for safety and liquidity in that Brookings paper that is linked up there, that drove the natural rate of interest down over the past few decades, but also with a role for productivity. One thing that I should stress is that, these DSG models are fully fledged econometric models, so I can report the uncertainty about my estimates. Other models, such as Counts Foundation models, are not. They're estimated equation by equation, right? You can do a t-statistic on one equation, but you don't know the correlations, right? So you cannot reasonably put bands on whatever you produce in a coherent statistical way. These models can. Now, obviously, the uncertainty that we plot, those bands over there, right, reflect the uncertainty within the model. There is much bigger fundamental uncertainty, which is about the model, which model is the right model, right? And so in that sense, the idea of model combination, using different models, entertaining more than one model is very important. We're not there yet, but we definitely have that in mind. When am I supposed to finish? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I think, I said a lot of the stuff that I wanted to say, especially on the openness, including some questions. So 15 minutes, including questions. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, we do normative analysis, and this is from December 2012 FOMC memo, right? I mean, those are just a forecast for a variety of for 4 variables from our model, which is in green, as well as 2 other models, PRISM, which is from the Philly Fed, and EDO, which is from the Board of Governors, right? And then in that memo, we did a bunch of counterfactuals. So this is from the New York Fed. Now the colors are for different counterfactuals, depending, those were the days of the 4 guidance, if you remember. Using this model, you can ask the question, okay, now if you extend 4 guidance by 3/4, what's going to happen to the economy? Okay, so this is a natural policy question that we ask using those models. And without going into detail, you can see there what would be the effect on GDP growth and inflation. And you can do the same with alternative policy rules. So what if we, instead of the estimated interest feedback rule that we have in the model, we use nominal GDP targeting rule in green, or price level targeting. Those are the answer that the model gives. Of course, there's vast literature to which I contributed, suggested that, hey, maybe you want to put more than a grain of salt in taking those answers for granted. Nonetheless, they may reveal some insights that you don't have without the model. And finally, we do scenario analysis with these models. So, stuff happens. well, I guess Brexit, those slides were old, so Brexit happened. Is no longer a scenario, but when there was a lot of uncertainty of how Brexit is going to unfold and so on, well, that was a possible source of risk to the economy. And so we have scenarios which are produced, not necessarily by the DSGE model, maybe by other models, maybe by, BVARs, or they can be judgmental. So those scenarios are path for output and inflation or other variables, which then the DSGE model interprets and spits out other stuff that is relevant for policymaker, such as the natural rate of interest. Or we can say, given that scenario, if policy does that, then you ameliorate the effects, so you counteract that scenario. That's what you have to do to counteract it, right? Okay. Okay, so let me move next to the last part of the presentation, which is forecasting. Are there any questions up to now? We're good? Okay. Right. So we started forecasting, as I said earlier, sometimes in 2010. I mean, before I arrived, before 2008, the DSGE model was a simple 3-equation models, was not really so much used for forecasting. So we started really forecasting in 2010. Now, the 2010 period was a pretty challenging one, obviously challenging for US households and families, but also for us forecasters was difficult. It was difficult because it was very unusual in many, many dimensions. We had a deep recession, as you all know, which was not unlike previous deep recessions, followed by a swift recovery. That's what we call in that paper the loss recovery. And there were large and persistent and still persistent output gaps. These gaps, however, were not associated with negative inflation, with deflation, as traditional Phillips curve relationship would have predicted. Plus, unlike in previous historical episodes, the FRB, the Federal Reserve, the FFR, Federal Funds Rate, was stuck at the zero lower bound, and the Fed used unconventional policy. These are all things that are super new, and if you think of a stylized model like the DSGE model, you might be, dead in the water. And so it was really difficult for those models to forecast, so we check how we did. And the way we check is to use, since, as I said, we've been producing forecasts and documenting these forecasts. You can find them in the memos that I mentioned, or after 2014 in the blogs. We can check how we did. And those, are much more helpful than this kind of what is known as pseudo real-time forecast that you see in various papers. Of course, if all you can do is pseudo, you do pseudo, where people basically, cook up a model and then they go back using real-time data and then they forecast. This is great, but, the model comes afterwards. So you would imagine that if the forecasting performance isn't great, you don't show the results. Here, is the model that we had at the time, the forecast at the time. There's no look-ahead bias of any source. Now, to understand also, what features of the model work or did not work, we also do a pseudo real-time where, okay, we take this model with financial friction, one without financial friction, and see how they did. Now, common perception of forecasting performance of the DSGE model is that they're terrible, and here I have a blog on Bloomberg, I think, along those lines. But in reality, how did we do? Okay? So what I'm showing here, focus on the left, top left, is root mean square error, right? So at various quarters ahead. So 1 is the nowcast, 2 is 2 quarters ahead, and so on up until 8 quarters ahead, because that's how long we have the blue chip expectations. From the New York Fed DSGE model in red, and the blue chip. So the blue chip are the professional forecaster. The blue chip goes out is just a collection for a private service that puts out the forecast from various financial forecasters. Well, the result is that they're on top of one another. So in real time, we did about as well as those other guys. I should stress that the blue chip that we're plotting and that is a consensus forecast, so an average of forecasts. And we know from the forecasting literature that usually forecast, the consensus beat each individual forecast just because the idiosyncratic errors in forecasting gets averaged out. And so the fact that we are one guy, one model, and we do as well as the average kind of makes us feel good. This is with SPF. Now, SPF have a bit of an informational advantage over us. So what we do here, we take the blue chip date, say they usually forecast at the beginning of the month, right? And then we don't forecast the same time as they do because we don't care. We forecast for the cycle. And so we, take the information set before. We take the latest cycle before the blue chip. But since we have those guys once a month, we are pretty close, right? We are maybe 2 weeks of the lag. With the SPF, they forecast only 4 times a year. Sometimes the lag is more substantial. And you see for inflation, that kind of matters. They do better than we do, at least for core inflation. But for GDP, again, we do about the same. And then perhaps even more interesting is this stuff over there. I don't know if I have a pointer on the right-hand side. And here we compare our forecast with the one from the SEP, the Summary of Economic Projection from the FOMC. So these are the median Summary of Economic Projection forecast error, right, in purple. And again, the red is the DSGE. You see that for real GDP growth, about, the same year, 1, 2, 3, 4, now they are the year. 1 is the same year as we produce a forecast, 2 is next year, and so on. Well, we do as well for the same year about, but then, if you look at 3 years ahead, we have, almost, that's quarterly, about 30 basis points of gaining forecast error. Now, this is not a super long sample, but it's not bad. Okay, so, kind of at some level, especially the overperformance relative to the SEP is kind of puzzling. So why did that happen? Well, I guess one reason, is that maybe many, especially in the aftermath of the Great Recession, many SEP participants, FOMC participants, thought, like a lot of the profession thought, that after a deep recession, you had a fast recovery, because that's what had happened in the 80s. The DSGE model, so in fact, if you look at the left-hand side plot, here I'm plotting the data that we had at the time in black, the future data dashed, which we did not have when we produced the forecast, of course. And then the purple circles are the median tendency of the Summary of Economic Projections, and the red is the DSGE forecast. You see that those guys were forecasting growth in 2011 that was, 2 years ahead, above 4%. Basically, the thought was, man, the gap is huge. It's got to close at some point. Where for it to close, it better be that the economy grows at a fast rate. It didn't happen. And the DSGE because of the financial friction, as I will show you in a second if I have time, projected a slow recovery, as you can see from the red line, right? So, growth that was not bad, not a recession, but was about 2%, which is, as you can see, that's what it turned out to be. This is just going to say that the DSGE model changed over time. And then maybe probably the last slide that I want to show on forecasting. So tell me again, what's the timing now? Okay, great. I have some time. That including questions or not? Including, okay, so I want to wrap it up so there is time for more questions. Okay, so you might have heard of DSGE, they're all the same, right? And here we show that basically a DSGE model without financial friction, which is a plain Metzenbader in red, where the model with financial friction in blue produces much higher forecast error, or during this period, produced much higher forecast error. Why? Because that model sort of doesn't really have this sluggish recovery from a financial crisis feature that the model with financial friction has. I have more about that, but no time to talk about it. So let me talk about what we're going to do next, or what we're doing now, really, and then leave some time for questions. So, okay, so we're not doing that bad in terms of forecasting, maybe, but still, there's a lot missing, a long way to go with these models. One, it's annoying that we have only one model to interpret the economy. Obviously, there's not just one view of the word. There are many different views of the word and many different aspects that our current simple, relatively complicated maybe, but at some level, oversimplified model doesn't talk about. So what I just said is that there is not enough diversification. It's just one new Keynesian model, too much homogeneity. It would be good to be homogeneous. If we continue down that path, then there is a risk of having disconnect with the academia as academia has moved on to other stuff. Heterogeneous agents model, nonlinear models, and so on. Okay, so what are we doing? Again, to do all that stuff, we move from MATLAB to Julia for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, and we build a bunch of econometric and economic infrastructure, right? On the econometric side, you want ways of estimating nonlinear model, and that is tricky. So we coded, and if you click on those links, you get to our code, temper particle filter, which is a way of producing the likelihood of nonlinear model, as well as sequential Monte Carlo. We have a paper now on sequential Monte Carlo that I don't have time to talk about, but there's one thing that you should know about it, which is the fact that using sequential Monte Carlo, you can estimate these models in parallel, while standard Metropolis Hastings algorithm for Bayesian estimation, which I use in the popular package Danier, if you have heard of it, you cannot be parallelized. And obviously, given the use of cluster these days, parallel methods are clearly the way forward. And of course, we need to solve these models. So we have been working on heterogeneous agents with heterogeneous. We are now solving, and soon we will put out a paper where we show, where we solve and estimate a large heterogeneous agents model. Okay, so let me wrap up. The New York Fed DSGE model is a medium-scale DSGE model with financial frictions. I discussed its uses in policy analysis, which is forecasting, positive, normative, and scenario analysis. It has a great forecasting performance. Just kidding. Obviously, we can improve, but whatever views you had, I hope I convinced you that at least in real time, we don't do that bad relative to the quote-unquote competition. Still, there's need to change because we want to embrace model diversity. We want to have more than one model, and we want to move beyond the linear perfect information to representative agents framework as we want to talk about, more financial frictions and, things like inequality, wealth distribution, and how monetary policy interacts with all of this. And that concludes. Thank you for your attention.
On the last slide, you mentioned some econometric updates that would run things in parallel and would help reduce computational time. Could you give us an idea of how much computational time was reduced from before to after using, like, say, sequential Monte Carlo?
Yeah. So the paper that I mentioned on sequential Monte Carlo does that, produces all of that. But at some level, that is not very relevant, meaning the following, that in order for this representative agents, kind of medium-sized model, they're fast enough with today's computer, even with Denier, meaning, it doesn't really matter whether it's, 8 hours versus 4 hours. I mean, meaning that you before leaving the office, you start it in the morning, you get the results. But when, although, in that paper for, again, simple model, we have all of that. But where it really bites, if you want to do something complicated, like an heterogeneous agents model, there, if you do it sequentially, just the fact that it takes, you can do it the math yourself, right? If it takes a minute to compute a likelihood and you have to do it a million times, you see what happens. If you instead can do it in parallel and you have 500 cores, you just divide by 500. What I'm saying is not totally correct in the sense that there are overheads, whatever, but the general idea that you want to move from sequential to parallel, we think is very important and very promising. Please.
Thank you. Is there flexibility to consider or take into consideration the age of the cycle?
The what?
The age of the cycle.
The age of the cycle.
Yeah.
Again, not in a linear model.
Right.
Right? Because it's linear.
Correct.
Wherever you are, doesn't matter. In a non-linear model, which we don't have yet, but which we will work on, maybe it will, in principle, it should come into play. It should matter, right? But that's, precisely to address questions like that, right? Also, maybe even more important, it depends on the wish list, but nonlinearity is in financial market, right? The stuff that Bruno Meyer and Sandikot talk about, right? Feedback loops, all of that, right? Obviously, a representative agents model, a linear model cannot. I misspoke. A linear model cannot address it by definitions.
Just to clarify, I think that somewhere along the presentation, probably on slide 10, you said that the model is used to somewhat influence policy, correct?
That's our job.
Right. So given that, isn't comparing the result of your model to the blue chips or to others isn't that kind of irrelevant? Essentially, those folks are not, their job is not to influence policy, it's not to inform policy, it's just to do whatever it is for whoever their customers are. But you have a much wider, much more important customer base, and so isn't it more important to actually produce a model that is accurate rather than that's in line with whatever it is that you're viewing currently as your competition? Essentially, aren't you benchmarking to the wrong group?
Yeah. I mean, there is a fundamental philosophical questions here, right? That we're not out there to beat the oracle, right? Somebody who sees the future. We're, right? So who's the comparison? I guess for your questions, and it's a very valid question, the relative comparison is, other models used for policy analysis. Work by us, actually, in the handbook chapter, show that relative to, say, the FRB US model, even this Madsen Wouters model that I was kind of criticizing in terms of the forecast for the Great Recession, does better historically from 94 to whatever, 2004, 2008, than the FRB US. So, at the very least, you would say it's competitive. Maybe better, although, yeah. So, that's one. Now, we're not showing those results because the FRB US are not available publicly. There is a 5-year lag. And for that, we wanted the most recent sample. But yeah, no, that's a good question. But that is what we do. But I mean, again, we're not there to, so first of all, right, I mean, the most important thing for us, right, is to see whether the model is quantitatively off. We're there to learn, just like as humans, right? It's a competition just in the sense that from seeing how we forecast and other people forecast, we can improve our model. It's not a race in terms of the best RMSEs. It's just learning about the model and its failures. And where we can improve it. That's the most important thing for us. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Del Negro. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for the questions. That was a great talk. We'll be in touch with all of you soon about the next event coming up in the near future. And I hope to see you all again soon. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. Take care.